So this is how I connected with Novakovsky.
Right.
Yeah, so in June of 1978, a guy comes up onto the bima for an aliyah, and I don't know who he is, and but he just says to me, he says, Cantor, I'd like to talk to you a minute for after my aliyah. And he has his aliyah, and I hear he has, oh, quite a lovely voice, I'm hearing him. And didn't realize it was a voice that I had heard when I was a student at the seminary in 63 to, till 65, and then I got a job in Brooklyn, so I couldn't hear him anymore, but I used to go to his synagogue. It was just 2 blocks away from where I lived, and then he comes back and he says, come on, let's go into the room over here. He says, did you ever hear of the composer David Novakovsky? I said, oh yeah, sure, he wrote all that stuff for Neila. He says, well, yeah, he said, but that's the only stuff that people know about. But the thing is that the guy had this great congregation in Odessa, which was a flourishing Zionist community, and he had a choir there that was outstanding, and he was writing new music every week for that choir and the Cantor, and his just writing this incredible music. It was like Bach, And I said, wow, He says, and I have music, all the music that he was doing at that synagogue.
So this was Siegel from
This was
B'nai
Siegel.
Jeshurun?
What he had were the 3 books of what was the standard stuff that was going on already in the into the teens, right before World War I, when his accompanist, the person who was playing the little organ that they had, was moving to the United States.
So this was the choir and organ books.
The choir and
that
organ
they used
books.
Within the Broder Synagogue.
That's right.
I see.
Which included so much of Novakovsky, but included Minkowski. It had Naumburg and Lewandowski and Zolzer.
It was a practical piece of equipment for the.
And all the stuff
the music.
was handwritten by this guy Isidor Geller, because he was the person who had been working with Novakovsky back in the late 80s and early 90s and the 90s, and then in
1880s and 90s.
The 1880s. I'm sorry.
No, of course.
And then in 1901. 1901 became. I was 13 years old or something. I don't remember the exact. I think he was 13, and he became. They first instituted a harmonium there, and then later on an organ, and he was playing.
This Geller you're talking about.
Geller,
right.
Yeah, and he was like the assistant conductor.
There was some kind of connection between Novakovsky and orphans. Is that
That's correct. Novakovsky had been in a little place right outside of Kiev, and his parents died young, or his mom died young or something, and then he was in an orphanage, and that the way he came into synagogue was like because somebody heard him singing, this little boy, and they brought him into the
classic,
choir.
An ameliorative for child poverty.
Right, and
basically.
so he came into the I can't remember the name of the town that he was in, but I have it written down someplace. And then ultimately, as the Cantor, Nissen Blumenthal, who had been at the synagogue since it was founded in 1840 in Odessa. This was an Austrian group of people that came from the town of Brody, in Galicia, on the northern part of the Black Sea, I believe it was. But then a lot of those people moved to Odessa because it was a bigger port and a lot of harvesting and stuff over there, and that became a very important place. And so these people had a kind of a mixture of heritage because they had that Western European influence, and that German influence, and in fact they all spoke German,
right.
And so this synagogue had a rabbi who gave his sermons in that time in German. So this was in 1869, almost 30 years after the synagogue was formed, that that they brought Novakovsky there, and he started working. He worked part-time at the orphanage there, and that's where he was able to instill this beautiful music for little kids. So they came into the choir.
This was sort of not uncommon in chorschuls in Eastern Europe. So have there be an educational institution or actually just an orphanage associated with the synagogue, and they would develop choirs from
And of course, then he had some great male singers too. But the boys could do the soprano and alto part, and you have enough of them, and you mix them with with the. I don't remember, but I have a picture of the choir.
They did eventually start having women singers.
They
in the choir.
did later on, about 1908, 10, 12. That's when they started mixing. It started becoming, more of like the neologue type of a synagogue. But at any rate, so I got that music, and in that summer.
So Geller came to the United States.
So Geller came here about 1914, about the same time as Sukenik. And they were an incredible match over here. And they built this congregation into
Geller was the choir director here at Park Avenue.
He was the organist.
The organist, okay.
Yeah, the organist and the choir director, yes.
So how did Siegel end up with Geller's materials?
Okay, so here's the stuff. So Siegel on the west side was this big conservative synagogue in Park Avenue, and they're, both on the 87th Street on the west side and 87th on the east side, and they were kind of like, they both became soloists, singing became quite well known because the seminary started this weekly broadcast called The Eternal Light.
Yes.
And that was and they would take turns, these guys. One week it was Siegel, 1 week it was Putterman, and so they were like competitors. But what Siegel told me was that when Geller was retiring in the early 50s, he didn't want to leave this solo music, which he used to use certain parts of it for Putterman, but he never wanted to give it to Putterman.
Interesting.
Because of the personal, these jealousies.
Did they have a difficult relationship?
No, they didn't. But it's whatever. If you're working with a person and that guy is wants all this kind of stuff, and then you're working with another person who you don't work for, he was his accompanist.
I see.
So when Siegel would go out on concerts, if it wasn't, a weekend or something, he would be out there accompanying.
Right. So they had a different kind of relation, less power dynamic.
That's right. And so he left it with Siegel, and Siegel said, I see the music you're doing here, Lefkowitz, the music you're doing here at Park Avenue Synagogue. You just came here a couple years ago, and already you're doing this incredible music. He said, I think you can learn. So I took that music, and starting in July of and I was off for
July of which year?
78, July of 78. And I was working day and night because I'm looking through this music and I'm saying, how on earth do you have, boys in the choir singing soprano and alto of this complexity and singing high A's? I learned how to sing high A's when I was that young because my dad was encouraging me how to use head voice, when singing instead of chest voice that. And I had a teacher in school who loved my singing, and she inspired me. And I even sang some Puccini arias for her, made up the words, But so I became overwhelmed with this stuff, and I worked, and then I decided, well, this is going to be my spring classical Shabbat morning service. This is going to be all Novakovsky. And I said, and you know what? I see a Shabbat Rosh Chodesh coming there on April 28th of 1989. That's going to be my all Novakovsky music. And I said, for those pieces that I don't have specific thing for, I'm going to find the kind of things that'll fit.
Right.
You know, so like for example, one of the amazing things that I found was this thing from. It was apparently a wedding song, and it was who's the Hosea, I think, Hosea. It was Be'eras Tichli, which would do with the tefillin. I will betroth you to me forever, and I'm singing, and I'm thinking, what can I use this thing for? It's so beautiful, and it has this cello part, which can be my Cantor role, because the cello is the perfect.
A cello part that had been written by Novakovsky.
Yes, the cello. They had the cello part. It has soprano soloist, and it had a choir, and
So this was something that he composed for a wedding service.
Apparently,
right.
for a wedding,
with a cellist playing.
Yeah, all it said on the thing, it didn't even have the words there. It just said "Ve'eras tichle be'emuna." That's all it said on the top in Hebrew.
Right. It didn't have the
It
lyrics.
didn't have the lyrics in it.
I see. Yeah.
And you know, it was just a sketched manuscript. But I'm looking at it and I'm saying, well, what is the thing that this personal relationship between the spouse and the other one? I thought, well, how about God and the Torah with the Jewish people? So I said, Eitz Chaim He, that's the thing. And so I set this music for Eitz Chaim He, and Abraham Kaplan, our conductor, was like overwhelmed with this piece. He says, "This is a magnificent piece, you know," and it was unlike the other kind of Novakovsky pieces. It just had this dreamlike connection, you know.
Incredible.
You know, and anyway, and so that became then the thing I started carrying on. Well. Yeah, that was this big service on Saturday morning, which ran till about 12:30, and we started at 9:15 in those days.
Right.
And Monday, I come into my office, and my secretary has a message for me that a woman who knows the granddaughter of Cantor Novakovsky, of David Novakovsky, is in touch, wants to speak to you. And so a woman from the synagogue whose teenage friend lived out in California now, but she knew her, you know, when they were young. She was the young, well, it was from the children of Novakovsky, and she was the youngest one, so she was this person's age. But apparently this person, Mimi Goldfinger was her name. Her name is on the windows in the sanctuary. And Mimi had this friend in Washington Heights who was an older sister, who was a daughter of Novakovsky, and she wants to speak to you. And I'm overwhelmed. I get on my phone. Well, we didn't have cell phones then, but I dialed, and I called her up, and she said, I was so happy to hear about this. She said, I have two brothers living out in California, and my younger sister, whom Mimi Goldfinger knows, she was so overwhelmed when she heard this magnificent music, and my brothers have this music that they recently got. That had, and you know, tell me that this was music that was from before the war, and it was hidden, and then they managed to get it back from, it had been given to Hebrew Union College, and then they wanted it back, and they finally got it back, and you know, they're so anxious to hear, you know, about this. So she
So did you get that material from?
No,
from
well,
the
she
children
didn't. She
eventually?
told me she does have a little bit of the material, you know, that they had found later and stuff,
There's a story about hidden material in something that was buried, or
yes, well, and then so I don't need to go into all that, but apparently Novakovsky had I think a niece who was a singer, an opera singer or something, and so she had left Odessa, and so when the things were really coming apart, and the you know, the Bolsheviks were like shutting down the synagogue, and this was about, it's 1920, 1921, and the place was not going to survive, and Novakovsky was old already and close to passing, and so the music was packed up and sent to his niece over there in Germany someplace. And when things became really bad over there, then she connected with a family that was very close with Jewish people, and they buried it in their farm so that it was in a safe place. And then after the war, like in 47 or something like that, then the family started connecting up with that family. Like wasn't there anymore or whatever. But by like 51, Helfman was at Hebrew Union College in the School of Sacred Music, and Binder knew about Novakovsky's music from way back, from when he was young. By the way, I saw Binder's nephew yesterday. Oh. He's a dental guy. It was good. I hadn't seen him for a year. And anyway, so Helfman started following after that, and by 52 they got all of these manuscripts over on 67th Street.
The ones from Europe that had been buried.
Yes, yeah, that was at the Stephen Wise, what used to be, that's where Hebrew Union College was.
So Novakovsky's music existed kind of in two, we'll call them editions. One was the one that Geller brought with him, and the other was what was buried on this farm in Germany.
That's correct.
So, and was it the same music in the two collections?
Well, yes, but there was so much more.
In Geller's?
No.
In the buried.
Yes,
material.
because like in any synagogue, you're doing a variety of different kind of
Geller's
music.
was what was in practical use
That's
at that particular time.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's then they would do a new piece this week.
Right.
Different.